"I say, Johnny." This was addressed to Baker, his number 3. "Yeah," replied Baker succinctly. "What was that the CO said? 13:30? Right. Well, I was thinking, that's 1:30, isn't it? Right. Well, what do we do for dinner?" Before anyone could give him a suitable reply, and the suitability would have been open to a lot of doubt, an American beat us all to the draw. From somewhere in the Okinawa area, anything up to 50 miles to the north, came a cheerful Bronx voice. "They send your dinner up to you. What else?" In all the RT chatter that filtered through the headset every day, it was, I suppose, only natural that one should perk up a little when friends' voices were recognized, particularly when they came from other carriers. A voice from nowhere, apparently young and naive, came up on the RT asking something which I would have thought to be self-evident and quite elementary. Our good friend Gammy Godson, Colorado of one of Indomitable's Hellcat squadrons, appeared to be in agreement, for it was his voice which promptly told the youngster not to be such a bloody fool, always good advice. A few days later we returned to the carrier on a dark, stormy evening, with plenty of pitch to the ship's stern and great frothy bow waves breaking down her side. The voice of Indomitable's FDO came up, ordering her waiting flights to switch on navigation lights to assist the batsman. "Wilco, out," came the reply from the senior flight commander, and I was delighted to recognize the voice of my old friend Sammy Langdon. I was still thinking about him, and of our good times together at St. Merin and in Egypt when one of his flights spoke to him. Funny how the youngsters could always be relied upon to provide the light relief, and this lad was no exception. "I say, Sammy." "Yes, what is it?" "Which is the switch for the navigation lights?" Like us, the majority of the Hellcat boys were not night flyers, and apart from those switches which we used daily, the vast expanse of the electrical switchboard down on the right-hand side of the cockpit was unknown territory to us. Sammy was a gentle, quiet creature with a voice which never rose above a subdued conversational tone. "Buggered if I know, old son. Do what I've done. Put the lot on and don't mind the expense." I looked towards Indom. Sammy's aircraft, just turning into the round down, looked like a Christmas tree. Wingtip lights, formation lights, navigation lights, landing searchlights, all were blazing in magnificent illumination. He never changed. A few days later, both he and Gammy Godson were shot down. 2 great pilots, 2 good friends. I had heard their voices for the last time. It was inevitable that we should become the target for a kamikaze attack, and April 6th was the day. I had sneaked into my cabin to freshen up after a hot, sticky day when everything happened. The 4.5-inch battery above me opened up, and, as usual, everything took off. Books, shoes, glasses, photo frames, all showered down to the deck of my cabin in a hell of a mess. Something was really happening. I galloped down the passage to the nearest ladder, which I reached just before the Bofors started to crackle, and I was halfway up to the flight deck when the whole ship jumped 3 feet in the water. Torpedoed. It wasn't a torpedo. It was a kamikaze, and the Japanese who had expired in the last few seconds had come out of a cloud on the port beam in a fast, shallow dive. One of our Bofors gunners hit him with his first shell and continued to hit him all the way down. Seconds before the Zeke reached us, the whole tail assembly parted company, and, having lost his rudder, the Japanese slid off course. Instead of crashing into the angle of the island and the flight deck, which had been his intention, he hit the front of the compass platform with the starboard wing, and the plane, bomb and all, crashed into the sea 30 yards from the ship, where the whole lot blew up. The wind was from the starboard side, and we were immediately inundated with a shower of crankshafts, pistons, sections of fuselage, and assorted pieces of Mitsubishi manufacture. The pilot's dinghy, a gaudy red and yellow affair, flew lazily across the deck, inflating itself in transit, and fetched up on the port aerial mast. The pilot's own skull was the first object to land on the deck, to be gathered up quickly by the medical profession. Perhaps the most macabre moment of the short action involved Bob Finley, our piano-playing captain's secretary. who at action stations was the captain of a multiple pom-pom on the port side. When the Japanese appeared from the clouds, Bob was ready and full of zeal, his eye glued to the gun's rubber eyepiece and his hands ready on the twist grip controls. When the aircraft lined up on the ship, Bob sighted through the ring sight further up the gun and let go, double forte and decidedly con brio. As the second kamikaze, for there were two of them, made his dive, Bob opened up again, but had to cease fire momentarily to flick away, somewhat petulantly, something which partially obscured the ring sight. He didn't feel very well 2 minutes later when he realized that what he had removed so peremptorily was a slender strip of Japanese flesh, about half a rasher. Things like that shouldn't happen to a captain's secretary. One act of cold-blooded courage must be recorded. When the kamikaze appeared, we had 2 Corsairs ranged on the centre line, all set for takeoff. Churchill was leading, Parley astern of him, both with engines turning and ready to go. Suddenly the after 4.5-inch guns commenced to fire, simultaneously with a red warning over the tannoys. The 2 pilots bailed out, and together with the mechanics who had been holding the chocks, ran to the island for cover. The steady, shattering thump of the 4.5s, ear-splitting in the painful explosions from their muzzles, and the whip-like crack of the Bofors and Oerlikons on all sides made incoherent all thought and speech. Parley, on leaving his aircraft, had found time to pull the mixture control back to automatic cut-off, which stopped the engine instantly. Churchill hadn't lingered, and the engine of his Corsair was still ticking over at about 300 revs. Now the engine's vibration, the tremor of the deck as the gunfire shook the ship, and finally the ship's leap into the air as the suicider exploded, all these proved sufficient to dislodge the aircraft's chocks, and the Corsair slowly moved forward and slightly to port. In a matter of seconds it would reach the port nets and plunge over them into the sea. 75,000 pounds, apart from any injuries it might cause on its way. There might be kamikazes about, although I couldn't see any as I emerged onto the flight deck. All I could see were shells exploding at a great height, and a strung-out flight of Hellcats tearing upwards towards a bank of cumulus way up above us. A tug on my sleeve brought me back to ground level. From the door to the island, where he had sought shelter, came Domain, our high-diving electrician, running swiftly towards the moving Corsair, completely disregarding kamikaze and gunfire. He leapt onto the wing and climbed into the cockpit, where he managed to hit the foot brakes in the nick of time, just as the wheels reached the 3-inch deck edge. He switched off the engine and sat there, cool as a cucumber, until 2 lads ran across with sets of chocks. I tried in vain to get a DSM for him, for his was a deed of true bravery in the middle of an action. He was, however, mentioned in dispatches which showed at least that his courage had been recognized by the hierarchy. Finally, it should be recorded that only 7 seconds had elapsed between the kamikaze's first appearance through the overcast and his explosion in the water. It was, without a doubt, one of those occasions when seconds can stretch into eternity. Back to Hirara as a change from Iriomote and Ishigaki. On this particular afternoon we were on a 3-hour patrol, cruising in lazy circles over the island at 15,000 feet. We had searched the airfield, nothing. By now they were pretty wise to us, and such aircraft as they were holding on the field were well hidden and out of harm's way. After 2 hours of this, one can become impatient and restless, and one looks for action. Action, for God's sake, before we go mad. The hell with this, lads. Let's go down and see what we can find. We plastered the brickwork of a Coast Guard station on the northernmost corner of the island, but there was no sign of activity. Probably it had become a favourite target for the learners, and the gentlemen of the Coast Guard service had decided that there were other and safer ways of spending an afternoon than sitting in a white box waiting to be shot at. I saw their point of view. That certainly didn't satisfy our lust. We beat up a small coaster, little more than a large fishing trawler, until I felt like a big bully and left them in peace to run into shallow water to beach what was left of her. We saw some Japanese soldiers dash for shelter into a row of detached houses on the outskirts of the town. One run down the row was enough to bang some incendiaries into them. That was sufficient to make me feel a cheap little vandal, and I slunk away, taking my 3 lads with me. We weren't winning the war playing around like this. It must have been about 16:30 as we crossed the town, flying at about 8,000 feet. Glory be, there was a parade ground. What was more, it was pretty full with all the licentious soldiery drawn up in serried ranks. One of the Corsair's drawbacks as far as the enemy was concerned was that the exhaust roar from its 18 cylinders was all behind it. There was virtually no noise from the engine apparent until the aircraft was almost overhead. It was said that the Japanese called it the Whispering Death for this reason. So when I decided to attack this juicy target, they broke formation only when it was too late for most of them to find cover. There were 3 possible angles from which to attack, only one of which was dangerous. After an afternoon of sheer frustration, monumental stupidity born of weariness, and a touch of twitch, chose for me the route which in normal and more carefree times would clearly have indicated a sticky death this way. In my eagerness to get in amongst it without losing the invaluable element of surprise, I banged the stick over to the right and down, leaving them to follow as best they could. It was providential that I did so, for had I led them down in an orderly formation, at least 2 of them would have bought it. As it was, they had scarcely made their move to follow me down when they realized that I had made a hash of things, giving them time to alter their own approach to something much safer and more airman-like. Certainly I wrought a bit of death and destruction, there was no doubt about that. With that enhanced, falcon-like vision which fiercely pumped adrenaline produces at moments of high excitement, I could see soldiers fairly bouncing away from the sledgehammer impact of the .5 shells. It needed only a touch on the rudder bar to cover square yards of the parade ground, and there was a fair number of bodies lying motionless as I levelled out and pulled away. And then I saw it. Rising sharply from the back of the military area was a sheer cliff-like eminence which I had completely missed in my haste to get to ground level. Now, as I approached it at 300 knots, it looked like the north wall of the Eiger. Taking my life in my hands, I pulled on the stick for all I was worth. I can only remember thick streamers springing from my wingtips before I blacked out good and true. The blackout hit me like pentothal. There was no greying out, no fuzziness. I went out like a light. When I recovered, I was out at sea, climbing gently at about 150 knots, safe and sound. The others had formed up on me again and were gazing at me with uncomprehending eyes. Well, they might. They had all been enthralled by the spectacle of their senior and most stupid fool of an officer busily trying to kill himself. I hope my guardian angel put in for overtime, for, by God, he had earned it. April 7th started off in great style. We were over Miyako in the early morning and had a field day, with 2 aircraft destroyed and 1 damaged. Things were going well, and the boys were on form, and then it just had to turn into one of those days. Percy Cole took his flight to Hirara in his own particular style. His method, a good one too, was to approach the island from the west, fly through the town at chimney-pot height, then drop down onto the airfield like the wrath of God. He told me later that, as he was leaving the town and approaching the airfield boundary, short-range flak flashed from the gun emplacements on the field, prompting him to look across and up to Marrett. He was flying 40 feet above the rest of them, and Percy screamed at him to get his head down. But young Marrett never heard him. As Percy pressed the RT button on his throttle lever, he saw a shell blast through the windshield of the luckless Marrett's aircraft. The plane rolled onto its back and tore into the ground at 300 knots or more. On the previous evening I had finished the flying orders for the following day and wandered along to the wardroom. There was time for a couple of drinks before going to bed. Winnie Churchill was the first man I bumped into. "Winnie, just the man I was looking for. I've put you on to Ishigaki for the first shift, okay?" "Yes, sure, boss. My own boys." "Yes, as usual." I paused for a moment. "Now remember, no fooling." He gave me an old-fashioned look. "You know those fools on Ishigaki as well as I do. Unless you damn well have to, no more than 2 runs. Now his look said, without a shadow of doubt, "Windy fool." I ignored it and pressed on. "Look, don't be a bloody fool. You know they have the measure of you after 2 runs down that strip. I don't want those kids of yours to be killed because you want to be a hero. I just want new kids to be given a break." Johnny Lauder, his No. 3, was a good, solid, experienced hand. It was the other 2 I feared for. So on April 7th, Winnie went to Ishigaki. They came back with one of Mike's flights, and I was standing with Wings on his bridge when they came down to the carrier. But there weren't 8, only 7. The 1830 boys came on first. Good, clever landings, the wires screaming out as they were arrested and the barriers clanging as they taxied up the deck in the old, efficient rhythm. There were 4 of them, so it was my flight that was one short. The 3 of them came on, again good, safe landings. The oxygen masks hid their faces, but certainly Winnie wasn't there. I would have known him. Johnny Lauder jumped from his cockpit at the front end and came running down the deck. He bounded up the ladder and joined me. He had a stammer which excitement and emotion were now exaggerating. "It's Winnie, Hans. I'm awfully sorry. It's Winnie. He's gone." There were tears in his eyes, running down in channels through the grime left by his goggles. They had made a couple of runs up the airstrip, smacking 1 or 2 aircraft parked on one side. They then flew up and away, their job done. After a minute or so, Winnie tapped his headphones, the top of his helmet, and pointed to Lauder. This signified, "My radio is unserviceable. I am handing the lead over to you." Winnie wheeled out of the formation and dived back to Ishigaki. Johnny turned the flight so that he could keep him in sight. Lauder said he saw him tearing in from the west. He had no idea why he had gone back. They had seen nothing which called for another attack, but maybe Winnie had. He reached the eastern end of the runway, and of the island itself, when his aircraft seemed to falter. Then it turned over very, very slowly and slid into the sea. My immediate reaction was to be furiously angry. Why the hell did he have to be the clever fool and refuse to listen? Why the hell did he think he was invulnerable where so many other pilots had fallen? But I couldn't be angry any more when I saw Jack Parley's face. They had been inseparable buddies since they had joined up together in New Zealand. And Jack's face showed what it was going to mean to him to have to fight the rest of the war without his cobber. Churchill was as brave as a lion. He loved living and he loved fighting, although I am convinced there was not the slightest need for him to return to that death trap. I know, too, that one can rarely change human nature. If I could have brought him back to life that instant, given him a corsair, and told him to go back and belt hell out of Ishigaki, he wouldn't have hesitated. He wouldn't have had it any other way. On April 11th, the staff decided that we should attack the kamikazes on their home ground, and strikes on Formosa were laid on. The weather intervened, however, and the operation was delayed for 24 hours. The following morning we provided a strong escort of corsairs for the Avengers, as they made their way to Shinchiku Airfield, on the northwestern corner of the island. As we flew along the north coast, 7 or 8 miles from land, Jake Millard came up on the radio to report that his aircraft was failing quickly. Jake, of 1830 Squadron, was a great fellow both in stature and in spirit. Prior to the war, he had been on the Metropolitan Police Force, and was renowned as a swimmer and a water polo player. He was also a reliable pilot with a truly remarkable accident-free record. I looked around to find him already losing speed and height through reduced power. We talked briefly, and I realized that he had no alternative but to ditch. I looked at the coast, my watch and the compass, and hoped I might be able to give something like a reasoned suggestion of his position. Then I told Baker to go down to see how Jake fared when he hit the drink. Johnny watched him glide into a moderate sea as I pumped out a mayday signal. Johnny then saw him start to swim towards the shore, and we shall never know why he hadn't rescued his dinghy from the sinking aircraft. By this time the strike was well down the coast, so Johnny climbed back to a fair altitude to transmit another mayday signal, confident that the air-sea rescue services in the area would pick him up. He then descended again, this time to sea level, but he was unable to find Jake again. As I have said earlier, it is extremely difficult to spot a man's head in the northwest Pacific. By now we had reached Shinchiku. Cloud level was down to about 2,500 feet, and visibility inland was poor. The Avengers went in to bomb the airfield and adjacent roads and railway lines. We did a quick pass round the airfield. There was little opposition and nothing to hit. We made another circuit of the field. This time the short-range flak burst into life with a vengeance, fierce and persistently accurate. Eventually we rejoined the Avengers off the coast, feeling as though we had come on a wild goose chase. We had been back in the ship for only a short time when there was a flurry of excitement. We were summoned at the double to see wings. "Panic on, chaps! Maximum effort required. Get every damn thing that will fly refueled and rearmed. The Admiral's calling for an all-out effort." Mike was the first to speak. "What's the target, sir?" Shinchiku again. "Get them cracking." I looked at Michael, then back to Wings. "But there's damn all there, sir. Hell, we've just come back. It's like Easter Sunday." "Hans, for God's sake, don't argue. Get on with it. The Admiral says there's more than 300 aircraft there." Mike looked as bewildered as I felt. He tried again. "So far as I'm concerned, there are 300 bomb craters there and nothing else. The Admiral has to be talking about somewhere else." By this time the discussion group, it was now war by committee, had moved from the flying bridge to the compass platform. Now the captain joined in. "You're sure about this?" We nodded. "You're sure you've been to Shinchiku?" Nods of assent again, unanimous and vigorous. "And you say there's nothing there?" "Absolutely nothing, sir." "Right. Leave it to me for 5 minutes, and don't pull out any stops until I say so." Within a few minutes he recalled us. The flaps off. It seems that a pilot from another carrier reported that there were 3 or 4 aircraft. Some IO has apparently written down 304 and has reported it to the staff as such. He waited for explosions. None came. For once we were tongue-tied. "So the Admiral has called off the strike." He grinned at Ian Sorrell. As we walked down the flight deck, Mike said in his unemotional way, "Now how the hell does anyone with any sense at all get around to accepting as gospel a figure like 304? Jerry Connolly, a southern Irishman whose famous uncle had been shot as a rebel by the British during the Easter Rising of 1916, and who accepted Englishmen with an easy-going tolerance, snorted and allowed a derisory grin to spread over his face. They must have worked it out that the pilot, whoever he was, counted 912 aircraft wheels and divided it by 3. That's the English way, isn't it?" Jake Millard never made it. The Mayday signals we had transmitted whistled up an American Martin Mariner flying boat, expert at its job of air-sea rescue. But although they searched the area assiduously for hours, they had no luck. Jake had gone forever. Finished with engines. And then, like so many times over the past years, it was all over. For Illustrious, April 13th was the last day of Operation Iceberg, and after spending 2 days in the replenishment area with the fleet train, we sailed for the Philippines. Our anchoring in Leyte Gulf and the anticipation of the usual traffic between ships was clouded with sadness for me. Johnny Baker's brother Sam was an Avenger pilot in Indomitable. In recent weeks we had seen him pull off a classic ditching alongside a destroyer when his undercarriage failed to extend. It was done so magnificently in a nasty short sea with a vicious chop that Sam and his 2 crewmen had been rescued without difficulty. In fact, I doubt even if Sam got his hair wet. So now Johnny took a boat across to Indomitable to see how Sam had fared in the Sakishima battles. He was frozen to the spot when her officer of the watch informed him on arrival at the gangway that his brother had been killed up in the islands. I felt deeply for John. He was, and still is, a fine chap, and in post-war years I was to be fortunate enough to become acquainted with all his family. To lose one's brother was bad enough, but to learn of it in such a manner was an even more bitter blow. I wondered then, as I do now, at the callousness of Sam's friends and senior officers who so lamentably found this to be their way of breaking such news. It could so easily have been done more delicately. A private signal to Illustrious would have enabled Captain Lambert to tell Johnny the bad tidings in his own very special way, with infinite kindness and sympathy. There was, however, a more pleasant surprise awaiting us. There, across the great harbour, looking very smart and warlike, lay formidable third ship of our class, freshly arrived from the UK. She looked good, and her corsairs on deck brooded, as always, like menacing harbingers of death. Michael Tritton was an old friend of Judy Garland, one of her corsairs' COs. With bitter memories of the toll that Sakishima Gunto had taken of our boys, he went across to Formid to put Judy wise as to what constituted life and death up in the islands. He would do it well, too, for there is nothing pedantic about him, quiet, reserved, pleasant, and no fighter-boy nonsense. But Judy was in no mood to listen. "Cut the shop, old boy! Get this drink down, you!" Mike would have liked to say, "No Hendon air display tricks. Sneak up on them and hit them first time, for there won't be a second chance. Be a dirty fighter." No one wanted to listen. But then, who does? We all know very well how to do it, and need no lectures. We all insist on learning it the hard way. When they went to Sakishima, Judy was killed on the first day, diving down to do a strafing run. But we didn't go back. Formidable had 3 propellers, a fresh crew, and a new on-the-ball air group. We had only 2 propellers and a crew and air group who were now very weary and firing on only 3 cylinders. Our time to depart had come. Some of the young men who had joined us as replacements only during the last 2 or 3 months were transferred to other carriers to work out their stint: Johnny Lauder, Don Cameron, Sid Newton, young Hartshorn, Johnny Maybank. We sat in Leyte Gulf for a day or 2, refueled and took on supplies. Then, one fine day, we left the Philippines forever. Illustrious was going home. As we passed through the Bismarck Sea en route for Sydney, we heard the wonderful news that the war in Europe had ended, VE Day. About 1800 we told our attendant destroyers to sheer off out of range, then gave the Bismarck Sea a feu de joie with everything we possessed, from 4.5-inch guns to very pistols. For 30 seconds there was one hell of a racket. The captain said a few words to the ship's company, most of whom were on the flight deck to watch the fireworks. He was followed by the chaplain, who asked us to join him in prayers. Then Captain Lamb came back to the microphone to announce splice the main brace. We descended to the wardroom and, for the one and only time during the commission, had a glass of rum. Our voyage down the eastern coast of Australia passed remarkably quickly, and more farewells were in the offing. When we reached Sydney, we would be parting with pilots who were heading directly for home instead of the United Kingdom: Johnny Baker and Mo Pawson to Canada, Mick Ritchie, Matt Barber, Jimmy Clark, and Pop Quigg to New Zealand. We would be leaving Jimmy James in Sydney to give the doctors a chance to heal his broken arm. He wouldn't get very far with the nurses unless they were agile and extremely cooperative, for our does had constructed one of those preposterous girder jobs on which the offending limb reposed at a great height. As we approached Sydney Heads, we flew our corsairs off to Bankstown, and that was the last we saw of them. Strangely enough, I felt no twinge. I can only suppose I assumed without question that in a matter of months we would be back at Bankstown to pick up new ones. We flitted round Sydney like a cloud of moths with no home to go to. Probably because we were tired, there was no great burning up of the town. There was an air of anti-climax mixed with a certain amount of relief. Certainly there was no hilarious rejoicing at our release from the chores and the daily hazards of Sakishima Gunto. Japan still had to be broken, and if their defense of Iwo Jima, Saipan, Okinawa, yes, and Sakishima was any criterion, to beat them on their home ground would be hell let loose. In our secret hearts we knew we would be back again, but all that was in the future. It would be a long time before we sailed again through Sydney Heads. So we lived for the day and wondered, in the vaguest possible way, what tomorrow, or next year, would bring. At last we sailed, and it seemed strange to be passengers. The hangar was a great echoing emptiness. The barriers and arrestor wires had been unshipped. There wasn't an aircraft in sight, and from Sydney Heads we saw not a ship until we sailed into Aden to refuel. We stopped for 24 hours in Port Said, where Ian Sorrell and I spent an hour or 2 at the Officers' Club. At midnight we strolled down to the quay to look for a boat to take us out to the carrier, anchored in the stream nearly half a mile away. There was a small rowing boat tied up, with a couple of the usual unsavoury characters aboard. "You want boat, Captain?" shouted one of them. We walked over to the steps and told them where we wanted to go. We were in a mellow, generous mood and didn't argue too vehemently about the fare. The oarsmen bent to their task as we settled ourselves in the stern sheets. Somewhere about halfway they stopped and rested on their oars. "Come on, Igri, Igri!" I shouted, using one of my 2 words of Arabic. "More money, Captain. We want more money." This is it, I thought. It's the old taxi racket all over again, but this time surrounded by water. I looked around for a weapon and was relieved to see that the tiller could be unshipped, but there was nothing for Ian. Strangely enough, for a man with no experience at all of the wiles of the Egyptians, he looked remarkably calm. He was still very composed as he produced a .38 revolver from his trouser waistband. "Just carry on rowing and no funny business," with a menacing wave of that thing in his right hand. Needless to say, we reached Illustrious in record time. Some of our young men had learnt a little about it even in 12 short hours. When Ian and I went down to the wardroom, we were lucky enough to find that some kind souls had kept a couple of drinks for us, for the bar had now been closed for more than an hour. A few of the subbies were saying hard things about the local inhabitants for, despite warnings from older desert types, they had nevertheless fallen for one of the oldest tricks under the pyramids. "You want dirty pictures, Captain?" was the opening gambit, with a quick flourish of a photograph, postcard size, of an Edwardian gentleman clad in black socks, sporting a large handlebar moustache, on the point of bestriding a buxom middle-aged old sport in black stockings and fancy garters. "Packet of 12, Captain. Very dirty. Very exciting. Only 50 piastres." The boys fell for it like a gluttonous salmon going for a fly. While the high-pressure salesman was running like a hare down some unmentionable side street, our young men were avidly inspecting their purchase, 1 nauseating shot of grotesque copulation, 10 rather pleasant views of Cairo Mosque, the pyramids and the de Lesseps statue, and a dreadful portrait of the even more dreadful King Farouk. After leaving Port Said, we organised evening concerts on the flight deck, even at the risk of damaging our precious piano by bringing it up on the afterlift. We had endless deck hockey tournaments. The highlight for most of us was a reversion to peacetime routine when at 1200 every day it was hands to bathe. The ship hove to, and for half an hour anything up to 1,000 men cavorted in the blue water, miles from land. Gibraltar, and another 24 hours stop. We took on board the entire crew of a U-boat which had recently sailed in to surrender. The captain was a nasty, flaxen-haired Teuton, full to the eyebrows of National Socialism, who, contrary to the attitude of his more reasonably minded officers, appeared to possess a desire to continue the war on a private basis. He had to be strictly isolated from them. When he proved to be thoroughly intransigent, he was confined permanently to his cabin. We applauded to a man the orders of the commander to the marine sentry posted at his door with rifle and fixed bayonet, that he should not hesitate to run through this Nazi should he attempt to leave his cabin. I spent quite a lot of time hanging around that particular flat in the fervent hope that the Marine would be given his chance. The U-boat's crew were a fine bunch of lads who readily joined our own ship's company in the task of chipping paintwork in readiness for the forthcoming refit. The gusto and thoroughness with which they went about their work should have told us that Germany wouldn't be too long in recovering from the destruction of their country. At 18 knots we plugged through the Bay of Biscay, and were now within reach of home. The minefields down the east coast of Britain were still to be cleared, and at the height of a lovely summer we cruised at a leisurely 13 or 14 knots through the Western Isles, sitting on deck and admiring the magnificent scenery as it was unfolded before us. What awaited us when we reached port? I don't suppose many of us gave it a thought. So far as we knew, Illustrious would undergo a pretty thorough refit. We would probably find ourselves in some less exacting jobs for a spell. And then, back to the Pacific without a doubt, for the subjugation of Japan itself promised to be another 30 years' war. The destruction of Hiroshima, however, to astound the world within a few short weeks, would resolve all our problems. It would also pose a bagful of new ones. So we turned the corner and cruised southwards to Rosyth, happy and contented in our serene, blissful ignorance. We didn't know that never again would we have to face the fearful flak over Ishigaki. Never again would our heads spin round at the cry of rats. 3 o'clock up? No more would the corsairs screech to a stop as they pulled out the screaming arrestor wires. The basha huts of Trincomalee, the crocodiles in the estuary, the incredible green of the Sumatran jungle, and the wide, limitless expanse of the great oceans. We had seen them all for the last time. Our war was over, and we didn't know it. And what of our fine squadrons? The Canadians and most of the New Zealanders had already gone home. Those of us who were still in the ship would be scattered to the four winds as soon as we reached port. Only a handful of us would ever meet again. Joe Vickers, Bud Sutton, Winnie Churchill, and a host of others were dead. We had left them in America, in Sumatra, in Ceylon, and in the great wastes of the oceans. When the tumult and the shouting had died, we would remember them, for the ties of the branch are strong, and the comradeship, the courage, the fun, the heroism, and the heartache of the war would never be forgotten by those of us who lived. And then, at last, the saga was over. We steamed up the Forth, the first ship to return from the Pacific War. Every vessel in the estuary manned ship in our honour, and their cheers floated down to us in turn as we passed them. There is something akin to a lump in my throat, even after all these years, as I hear the distant bugles sounding the still, as our great old lady swept majestically up to the dockyard. She was my ship, the only ship to which I had truly belonged. My pride in her was still unabated. Her magic name has ever since been part of my life.